I am now so honored to invite Dr. Dayna Long to make some brief opening remarks to set the stage for this panel conversation. Dr. Long is a professor of clinical pediatrics and co-director of the Center for Child and Community Health at UCSF Benioff Children's Hospital, Oakland. She has been a primary care pediatrician for over 20 years and leads research studies on adversity, trauma, and resiliency. Dr. Long is a truly remarkable advocate for children and is also a longtime friend of the Clinton Foundation and its early childhood initiative, Too Small to Fail. Please welcome Dr. Dayna Long.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am really glad to be here. And I'm here as a pediatrician, an actual pediatrician, not one that's trying to play a doctor on TV. And I want to talk to you all today about the really powerful connections between early childhood and climate change. I'm going to start with a story, and I actually I'm on call today, and my mother is somewhere here with my phone in case it goes off. But one of the calls that I received when we had our last firestorm was from the mother of a young child, a 3-year-old son, who in the Bay Area, our skies were filled with smoke. You could barely see ahead of you. And this young 3-year-old boy had asthma. He wasn't able to go outside because of the awful air quality that we were having. And although the mother was trying to keep him indoors, the smoke, it was creeping inside our house, through the windows, through the vents. And she called me because he couldn't breathe. I told the mom that she needed to get in the car and go to the emergency department, where the young child was given breathing treatments, he was given steroids, and he was admitted to the hospital. As a pediatrician, I'm telling you that climate change is real and it's affecting our children on, unfortunately, a regular basis. What we also know is that early childhood is a very critical time in the development of young people. During the first 3 years of life, 80% of a child's brain develops, and they're making millions of neuronal connections that will provide a lifelong foundation for their social, emotional, and developmental well-being. This strong foundation is what enables children to become resilient and strong adults. What we also know is that parents and children are experiencing the effects of climate change that impact young children's ability to develop into healthy adults. When I refer to climate change, what I'm referring to is the long-term shifts in temperature and weather patterns. And these shifts in weather patterns and temperature are affecting not only our health, but our housing, our access to food, our ability as parents to be able to provide safe places for our children to live. Climate change really affects us in 3 main ways. It affects our air, it affects our water, and it affects temperature. And I'm going to walk you through each of these elements and how I, as a pediatrician, am seeing each of these elements impact the children that I'm so lucky to serve. When we think about the air that we breathe, it's not only the wildfires, it's also the pollution that is impacting our children's health. I recently published a study whereby we looked at the correlation of data between air pollution, between experiences of trauma and adversity. And when I say adversity, I mean what we think of as abuse, neglect, and household challenges. These household challenges are having parents who use substances, having parents who are incarcerated, having parents who are divorced or separated. And we correlated that data with actually looking at children's DNA. DNA is our genetic code. It is what is going to be able to code each and every characteristic that we have. And what we found is that children who experience high adversity, who live in areas where there's very poor air quality, actually have shifts and changes in their DNA. Our environment is impacting our genetic code such that it is eroding the ends of, I'm going to take you all back to biology. So the ends of our DNA, their chromosomes, are called telomeres. And what happens with children that are experiencing adversity and high levels of air pollution is that they have literally, we call it weathering of those telomeres, of those caps. And when you get shortened telomeres and shortened caps, it can actually accelerate the aging process, and it leads us more susceptible to disease. When we think about water, what we often think about are floods. And how many of you all, like me, were afraid to drive your children to school during these atmospheric rivers? I was in the car with my son during one of these atmospheric rivers, and he said, "Mom, it feels like we're in the middle of a flood." The changes to our water, the changes that we're seeing with these huge rainstorms is not only affecting our ability to drive our kids to school, but also causing destruction to homes and other types of property that then lead to moisture in houses that can lead to higher levels of asthma and higher levels of allergy. Let's talk about temperature. I have 2 football players. Seeing them on the field playing in 117-degree heat is not healthy for children. I have a young 4-year-old patient who lives with her grandmother who's 68 years old, and during our heat spells, that grandmother has chronic pulmonary lung disease. She's basically homebound, doesn't have air condition. Imagine being 68, having 117-degree weather, trying to take care of your 4-year-old with no air condition. The way that they get through these heat spells is that they sit in cold baths, they use cold towels, and this isn't just that they're uncomfortable. For this grandmother, this is an issue of life and death. So as you've heard from these examples, every single child is impacted by climate change. And we also know that children that grow up in low-income communities, children of color who are already struggling with the habitability of their housing, with access to food, these climate changes are going to have even a more profound effect. Of course, we have to take concrete actions. We have to be able to build better waterways. We have to build buildings that can protect us from the heat. There's also a very human element to health, and that is the ability for all of us to have relationships with one another. Those relationships, we call it early relational health. It is early relational health that enables us to attach, that enables us to be resilient, that enables us to lean in and have the flexibility to adapt to climate change that often can be unpredictable. So what is it that I'm telling you all to do, right? You all are the ones that influence people. You're the content creators. You have networks. You are leaders. What we can do is we can picture the father who's with his 9-month-old amidst the storm who's playing peekaboo. We can talk about the teacher who is talking, reading, and singing to our kindergartners on a day when it is too hot for them to go to school. We can talk about the mother who is in the midst of the fires trying to practice breathing techniques with her 3-year-old for his asthma. I'm actually very, very hopeful because all of us are in the room together, and I'm very confident that when we can actually use the science to understand biologically what's happening to children, and then we can use the platforms that you all have, we definitely can make sure that we weather the future together. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the opening remarks, Dr. Long. I'm now honored to introduce today's esteemed panelists for the closing session. The Untold Story, How Climate Change is Changing Our Kids. I am so thrilled to have Secretary Hillary Rodham Clinton, just gonna beat my heart for a second, who is the most inspiring leader here with us today to talk about the work that she's leading at the Clinton Foundation. Secretary Clinton is joined by Gloria, Calderon, Kellett, an incredibly talented showrunner, director, producer, actress, and activist, as well as Anna Jane Joyner, founder and CEO of Good Energy, a nonprofit consultancy working to inspire and support climate change stories in TV and film. And we're so fortunate to have the wonderful Tamara Krinsky here to moderate the conversation. Tamara is an Emmy-winning TV host, writer, actress, probably an activist too, interactive media producer who is the host of the Science Channel series Tomorrow's World Today, where she explores how to utilize our natural and technological resources for a more sustainable lifestyle. As Marvel's red carpet host, she also has anchored live stream broadcasts for movies like Avengers and Black Panther. She is also the co-founder of The Screens, a creative team dedicated to advocating for scientific literacy in the general public and creating science-infused entertainment content. Please welcome our terrific panelists and moderator to the stage.
Hello, everyone. I'm Tamara. You've just heard way too much about me and not about these three. So I have to say, I am just so honored to be here on the stage with these women as someone who is an activist, a creative person, and a citizen. The work that these three women have done just makes me so proud and excited. So let's get to it. Secretary Clinton, we just heard from Dr. Long about the significant and very serious health impacts of climate change on young children's healthy development. You have a very long history of advocating for women and children. So can you talk to us about why you are now taking on this issue at the Clinton Foundation?
Well, first of all, thank you, Tamara. And thanks to Debbie Levin and the Environmental Media Association and all of you for gathering today to talk about this really critical issue. But as I think it's fair to say, it's kind of an untold story about how climate change is changing our kids. And that's what Dr. Long was providing an overview of. And you'll hear from all of the panelists about this. I wanted to just kind of place it in history. So about 10 years ago, we started something at the Clinton Foundation called Too Small to Fail. And it was an effort to try to take what science tells us about how children's brains develop and raise it up and amplify it and get it out where people live and work and play so that they too knew what we knew, which is kind of simple but profound, that reading, talking, and singing to your infants, your babies, your toddlers actually builds brain cells and capacity. So one of the places we took this message to was here in Hollywood to talk to showrunners and studio people and all of the folks who create content and put it in front of audiences. And it was great because immediately people started saying, wow, I mean, that's something that I didn't know, and I do it. You know, a lot of people said, yeah, I talk to my kid or I read to my kid, but I didn't know I was actually building, you know, a brain. I said, well, you are, and now try to help other people build some brains. And so about 15 shows over the course of a couple of years really began to center scenes with adults interacting with children in that way and talking about why they were doing it. Orange is the New Black had a great scene in the prison with a child visiting and a mother talking and playing with her child and explaining why, you know, she was helping her learn how to speak and get more words. Law and Order, SVU, same thing, and a lot of other shows. So 10 years on, we have seen the results of this work in so many places. In fact, we have a great partnership with the Laundromat Association of America because a lot of families spend a lot of time in laundromats, and the adults in those families bring their kids because there's nowhere else to leave them. So we now have libraries, little libraries, so that while the clothes are washing and drying, people can sit down and actually look at a book with their kid or read to their kid. So now we want to raise the visibility of this really important science-based information about what climate change is doing to children's development. And Too Small to Fail in partnership with the Rockefeller Foundation, has commissioned something we can get you all copies of, which is Climate Change in Early Childhood, a science-based resource for storytellers, about how you would go about talking about this. We know that extreme heat has very serious consequences on pregnant women, on infants, on babies, on toddlers. We know that the pollution from wildfires, something that you're all too familiar with here, has respiratory consequences, and most severely on children, and what that means for the development of asthma and other respiratory conditions. We know that disasters of all kinds, whether they are floods or intense storms that are coming with more frequency, often impact more dramatically women and children, especially young children. So there's a lot to be, I think, told in an effective way to convey information to people, but also to give them some possible solutions about how better to protect their children from extreme heat or any other kind of climate-generated weather condition. So I could not be happier to be here, and I really am grateful that, once again, so many of you who know how to tell stories are here to help us figure out how to tell this one.
So as you said, part of the piece is figuring out how to tell those stories. And that brings me to you, Anna Jane. You're the founder of Good Energy, which, as was mentioned earlier, is a nonprofit consultancy that's working to inspire and support creators who want to include climate stories. And as part of that, you've done a lot of research into the prevalence or maybe lack of climate stories. I would love for you to share a couple of your key findings.
Yeah, so we wanted to test our hypothesis that we weren't seeing much climate acknowledged in scripted TV and film. We worked with USC's Media Impact Project in 2021, looked at over 37,000 scripts that aired between 2016 and 2020, and looked at all the various ways you could say the word climate change, but also keywords like solar panels and sea level rise, and climate showed up 2.8% of the time. And that's just mentions. Actually, stories about climate are far, far lower. So obviously that is way too low and not reflective of how we're experiencing it in our real lives. So we, have created programs and toolkits to help shift that. And one of the tools that we just came out with this past March is what we call the climate reality check, which is a Bechdel test for a world on fire. And it's a baseline test. So it's just, does climate change exist in the world of the story? And we applied that to the 250 most popular films of the past decade. It was about, I think it was between 8 and 10% acknowledged climate. Stories are still very low. The good news is the last 5 years, it doubled. So we are seeing it increase. The best news I would say is that the films that passed the climate reality check made 10% more at the box office. So, yeah. So lots of progress, but still we have a long ways to go. And I'm so thankful that you're helping us make this happen.
Well, none of it happens without the creators. And Gloria, you represent that point of view here on this panel. You've done everything. You're an actress, you're a writer, you're a showrunner. Shows like One Day at a Time and With Love. So I'm curious, from your perspective, how do you approach taking some of the research that has come from these amazing women and their organizations and incorporating that into the work that you do?
Well, it starts, I think, because storytellers, I think, want to do this. I think, especially for us that are really thinking about the next generation, and for those of us that have children as well, all of my storytelling is because I want my children to live in a kinder and gentler world. And so, because I am the child of immigrants, we were green before it was cool to be green. It's called being poor. And anyway, washing aluminum foil? Washing aluminum, we did, yeah. Ziploc bags, you still do. So that was for economic necessity. And we would always use, like Tupperware, that was for rich people, we would reuse the pickle jars. And those are things that our kids think is awesome. So there's already been something, I think, that there's an awareness that kids think it's cool to go, like my daughter thinks it's way cooler to go to Goodwill than to do fast fashion, right? So like we're doing something right in that. because it's vintage, you know? Like, we have to rename and rebrand. So with One Day at a Time, which my co-creator, Michael Royce, is here in the audience. With One Day at a Time, it was so organic to the story. We had an immigrant family. We had a young social justice warrior in Elena, who, of course, Secretary Clinton was her idol. And it was very easy to, in any situation, have a joke or have a thought through the lens of this character. So we were really thoughtful with, okay, there's going to be no plastic, because Elena would lose her mind if there was any plastic. There's no, like, thank you for having water bottles that are in glass, right? Like, anything, there was nothing on the show that was single use. So there were little things. There were also, I think, you know, there's a lot of television people in there. Behind the camera, we have with Love, my last show for Amazon, we were an industry leader in behind the scenes sustainability, reusing wood to build sets, et cetera. That's all stuff that anybody who wants to talk to me about that, we have a sustainability report. I can show you that it does save you money. You have to spend a little at the top, but then you save money. And then, of course, Anna Jane's been so incredible in supporting, you know, the storytelling of, you know, for Halloween, for example, we did an episode on One Day at a Time where Elena was Greta Thunberg and her significant other was an iceberg. And instead of candy, they went door to door, as she would slowly be, you know, disintegrating. And they went door to door. Instead of candy, they just wanted to talk to people about climate change. So it worked with the story. It became funny for the story. But you can do things like on the roof of One Day at a Time. We had a scene on the roof. We just put solar panels there. No one talks about them. They just exist, right? So those are things, using reusable water bottles. You know, we had a character on With Love that opened up a gym and talked all about all the swag of the reusable water bottle and the fountain that you can put your water in. And all those little things do matter, and people are looking at those things. So I think making it an integral part of, especially young people having conversations, they do talk and think about this, and it could be a great thing to do.
I have a very quick follow-up question to that, which is, was that something that you as a showrunner had to say to the room to begin with and like state at the beginning, like, this is something that we want to do, or was it something that came out organically? Did you have to push for it?
We didn't have to push for it. I mean, we had, you know, the late great Norman Lear was our shining star. So we didn't. Mike and I were really given free rein to tell the story of this family. It was just so organic to the family. Like, I remember it was really a production meeting where in the pilot episode of One Day at a Time, the Penelope, the wonderful Justina Machado, is eating leftovers, and they had presented me with Tupperware. And I said, oh, no, what you need is like a butter container and then wash it like 50 times. That's what you need, because that's what that would be in. And they did. And they were like, how's that? Then they show me 3 butter containers, you know. And I'm like, oh, that one's perfect. You can barely see the writing. Doesn't Country Crock, is that what that was? You know, so that's how we would do it. But we were very supported. But I think, again, that's the legacy of Norman that allowed us to be supported in that way.
Well, when you have someone like Norman, obviously you're building on knowledge that has been accumulated over years and years. And you mentioned Secretary Clinton, that Too Small to Fail has been around for a little over 10 years. It was founded in 2013. And one of the things that you did, as you said, was you brought it to Hollywood. You talked to the community. And I'm curious about the new initiative with climate and also what you learned from that first foray with trying to sort of insert something that might not feel like it was an organic fit into storytelling.
Well, that it has to be organic, what Gloria was just saying. I mean, it has to be so integrated into the story. And the characters have to be, whether it's, you know, putting leftovers in washed out, you know, jars or whatever it might be, just very natural. This is what we do. This is how we live. These are the choices we make. And similarly, when we've started with, you know, reading, talking, and singing, it wasn't like a big announcement. Now I'm going to read to my baby so that she will build brain cells. It was more of a just kind of natural progression of who these characters were and how they took care of each other and how they saw each other. And I think that's really what we're trying to get to. You know, backstage before we came on, we were talking about how, you know, there's been a lot of really, really great efforts to convince people about climate change, and a lot of, you know, really dramatic information and even, you know, dramatic movies about, you know, the consequences that we are facing. And so we know that that part of the message of kind of hitting people over the head and saying, for heaven's sakes, wake up, it's going to be a disaster if you don't do something, is a little bit overwhelming for people because they're not quite sure, what am I supposed to do? I mean, there are things that they can do, and that's what we want stories to show them. A lot of the big structural, institutional changes have to happen at the global, national, obviously, state levels. But we want to empower people to have enough information to be able to do things on their own. So I heard Dr. Long talking about the lack of air conditioning. It's a really serious problem as the heat goes up. And in fact, last year, which was the hottest year on record, something like over 600 known deaths occurred in Europe. So, we're not talking about the global south, we're talking about Europe, but they haven't had to have air conditioning in most places. Even parts of our country, historically, we didn't, maybe you'd have one hot week in the summertime. I lived outside of Chicago. We'd have one hot week. My mother would draw the drapes, to keep the sun out, and, everybody would walk around with, fans and things like that. But it wasn't like fatal. It wasn't destroying kids' metabolism and biological processes because the heat was so unbearable. It wasn't killing the elderly because they had no way to escape it. So I think there are lots of things individuals can do, but they have to be made aware. And, stories, like, I can think of, a lot of the police procedurals that are on, and people, they do a wellness check, and it's, they're talking about how hot it is. It's unbelievably hot. Well, they go to check on somebody's elderly grandparent, and the person's really in bad shape because there's no air conditioning, or a wellness check on a pregnant woman who literally can't leave the house even because it's so hot. She passes out. I mean, the constriction of her blood vessels happens so quickly. Anyway, I think there's a lot that can be integrated into stories so that people become more aware, and then they think about how they can in their own lives or their communities' lives try to help.
Well, and I love the fact that I was reading the toolkit earlier, and it talks both about a lot of the direct effects that Dr. Long was talking about, but also some of the indirect effects that can happen, the stress that can happen around families when there's flooding, when there's relocation because of these climate extreme events. So,
well, I think we're going to continue to have, unfortunately, more and more natural disasters, and in odd places. I mean, if you followed the unbelievable flooding in southern Brazil a few weeks ago, just out of nowhere, and just hit with such ferocity, and killed a lot of people, livestock, and nobody really understood how that had happened. Well, it happened because of what we all know is going on in our climate. I was recently, a year ago or so, in India visiting women who work outside. And, these are women who do some of the hardest work in their society. And they are generational workers. They're salt farmers in the desert. They are construction workers. They're market stall women. They are trash pickers. And if they don't work, they don't get paid. Yet by noon, at 122 degrees, as it recently was just a week ago in Delhi, it is impossible to work. You can't hold a tool if you're on a construction site. You can't withstand the heat of the sun. So we're going to have so many consequences that are going to affect our economies, obviously are going to affect migrant flows. If we think migrant flows are intense now, climate migration is going to dominate the next 25 years with people moving from the south. We're going to have more disease because insects are going to be able to live at higher and higher latitudes. So these are all things that people are aware of, but need to better understand, and especially that everything we worry about has an absolutely greater impact on kids.
And I hope you were all listening because she just dropped about 10 different story ideas in the last 2 minutes. But it's a lot of information, right? And sometimes we as artists can feel almost a little intimidated by trying to incorporate the science and getting it right. And that's one of the things that I love about what you're doing, Anna Jane, because you are helping to create pathways and on-ramps for people to incorporate these topics into their stories. Can you talk a little bit specifically about how you're supporting writers and creators?
Yeah, so I've worked on climate change 20 years, climate communication strategy specifically. But in 2018, a writer on Madam Secretary, whose name is Alex Maggio, is now a good friend and one of our advisors, reached out to me because he wanted to tell a story about a young woman challenging her powerful evangelical father on climate change. My father is an evangelical megachurch pastor, and he was doing research, and he was like, you know, that's a real person. And so he got in touch with me, and my brother's a filmmaker, and all through film schools, I had read his scripts and given notes on scripts. So I knew just enough about the process of screenwriting to be a really good partner. I know it was Madam Secretary. How full circle is that? Yeah. But through that experience, just basically got on the phone with anyone who would talk to me and just, ask these questions. Why aren't we seeing more climate acknowledged in scripted TV and film? What kinds of support systems do you need to be able to change that? What are your hurdles? And that's really infused all of Good Energy's work. So we do a lot of qualitative research. Our director of strategy comes out of IDEO, and he managed all of their market research. So we've interviewed hundreds of TV and film writers and executives, including many of you. And some of the things that we found were, one, there's a fear of it being over politicized. However, my dinner table is a representation of the polarization in this country, and even my dad, who I would have put in the kind of denier conspiracy theorist camp for the vast majority of my career, has moved, and there's places where he totally agrees. He hates coal, he hates plastics because of the impacts on reproductive health and the oceans. So there's definitely spaces where we can reach across the aisle, but also it's just no longer true. There was a new study that came out by Nature that interviewed or surveyed over 130,000 people across 125 countries, and they found that 89% want to see political action on climate change. It was 69% were willing to give up 1% of their own income. And then, of course, if you go down to younger generations, it's just more and more. And so the idea that this is going to alienate people, as evidenced by our recent study, the films that acknowledge climate did better. And so that's a big one we have fought hard to overcome. Another one was that we, in the kind of mental map of a lot of writers, they were associating climate stories with apocalypse stories. So there wasn't kind of a division. So a big part of the work that we do is just opening up the menu of possibilities and using case studies and real life inspiration to show all of the creative ways that you can incorporate and acknowledge climate beyond just the apocalypse. The other big one we see a lot of is shame. So if somebody's shaming someone else about their plastic straw or their SUV, interesting tidbit is a lot of writers were feeling that. So their own anxiety about their own carbon footprint was making them feel like they couldn't authentically write about it. Which, we use Bill McKibben's, the price of admission into the climate movement is hypocrisy. It is not our fault that we were born into this, economic system. So that's a big thing that we try to overcome as well.
Well, as those of us who have been in a writer's room do know, sometimes it can feel a little bit like therapy. And Gloria, I want to kind of flip that to you, right? So one of the things that's been talked about here at the summit and in climate storytelling circles in general right now is this idea that we need more hopeful stories, that as cool as an iceberg looks cleaving on the big screen, if that's all we see, it gets really hard to imagine better futures. So more hopeful, more optimistic, but conflict drives drama and makes for a good story. So giving us a little bit of a peek behind the curtain, I'm curious how you balance those two things, which can often be in tension with each other, and what your advice to do that would be.
Well, look, I'm really fortunate that I work in comedy. So because really the source of my work, my why for being a storyteller, is my immigrant family, is making sure that Latinos are on screen, is making sure we are not just gangbangers and drug dealers, et cetera. So that is my whole purpose for story, is to change a narrative that is out there that is incorrect. So the same is true with climate change. And I think for me, it's going to be integral in all of my work because it is such a part of the immigrant experience. And I think then it's how do I get it into a script in a way that's funny? How is it, like with Love, there's a scene with a brother and sister where they're just fighting because the sister is staying with him and he's sick of her. And so it's like, you leave your clothes on the floor and you don't rinse out the jar and that goes into the landfill, Lil. Like, you know, like there's ways to get it in there. Like we had a couple that were meeting wedding vendors, these two young men that were getting married in the last season. And when they met with the wedding coordinator, they were like, outside wedding, well, climate change, so that's rough. It's gonna be hot at like 4. Like, you know, like even making mention that it exists, that it's a thing, that it's something that we have to consider and make alternate plans as a result of, is meaningful. And so finding ways to get it in so that it doesn't feel like homework, it doesn't feel like that's constantly my thing. How do I make stuff with the Latino community that doesn't make people feel like I'm shaming them, they're in trouble if they don't do this? There's also, I think, a fatigue that everyone feels after the pandemic and after, you know, there's a moment where people don't want to feel like they're eating broccoli when they're watching their TV. And I understand that. And as storytellers, we have to be sensitive to that. So then it is incumbent upon us to think about ways that we can sneak it in there. So I make a black bean brownie, you wouldn't know. You wouldn't know you're getting protein. And so it can't be broccoli. It has to be like, how do we sneak something in so that we're making mention, we're showing kids talking about it. We are modeling by showing lunches that are, you know, not single use. Like all of those modeling, and then how can it come up in conversation, I think is where we have to meet the moment with that. And if there's a way we can organically do that with character, that's where I would start. I think starting with character and making it true to the character and making it not feel like homework is the key.
Your black bean brownies sound way better than my mom's zucchini brownies, which was another sneak. So as you've been talking about the stories that we're watching on TV and we're hearing a lot about climate change, things we're all familiar with, you know, single-use plastics, heat, et cetera. This topic of childhood development and how climate change and all these extreme weather events are affecting things is very new. So I would love to hear one actionable thing you would love the folks in this room to take with them as they leave today when it comes to this topic.
Well, I think that our hope is that this very basic piece of information that when you think about the effects of climate change, please think about children. And it's not poor children, it's not children somewhere else, it's every child who can be impacted. Their physical and mental development can be impacted by extreme heat, by increased pollution, certainly by, you know, natural disasters. But to try to begin to just almost make that a known fact that people have to recognize in their own lives. And, you know, I was thinking about what Anna Jane was saying about her father and her family. You know, some of the people that we keep trying to get more involved in the whole arena of policies to deal with climate change are people who hunt and fish, people who are outdoors, people who have seen the changes but may not connect it to the lives of their children or their grandchildren. So any kind of connection that can be made so that the information that Dr. Long shared will become acceptable, not in a shameful way, but in a kind of increase awareness that then may lead individuals to take actions that can better protect their own kids, but also may make them more willing to take actions at a community level as well.
Thank you. Anna Jane?
So I got into this because great stories are vital to winning on climate change, but I also got into it for a very selfish reason, which is I live on the Gulf Coast of Alabama when I'm not here in LA for work. Even if we cut off all fossil fuel emissions tomorrow, my home is going to be dramatically changed. It already is. And I was struggling with a lot of climate anxiety and fear and anger and heartbreak. And where I go when I'm struggling is stories. And that's where humans have always gone, you know, for over 30,000 years. We've gone to stories to make meaning and find purpose and courage. So that is kind of why I do this work, why I think it's so important, is really for me, it was the mental health impacts and then the fact that I needed to see my world on screen to learn how to be human in the age of climate change, to find courage and joy and meaning. And so that is why I think stories are so important. Also very related to childhood development because the mental health impacts on children are just so scary. So just tell really great stories.
Gloria?
Did you tell them about your Bechdel test?
Yes.
Okay, all right. I wanted to make sure, in case, because it's so good. I would encourage you, like the best thing about things like this is we're all gathering because we care about something. And so for the storytellers, for you to return home and think, how can I incorporate this in some way into my work? The thing I loved about being side by side with Norman all those years is that I was often in spaces where I was challenged to try to bring something up in a way, and that's how you and I met. And so I did leave that thinking, what are other things I can do? Oh, I didn't know that even mentioning it is vital. How can I mention it in a way that feels organic? Like, let's give ourselves those writing challenges. How can oh, this scene currently takes place in a restaurant. Maybe they're on a beach picking up trash. You know, like, oh, can I model somebody recycling? We had a whole episode where Elena is at a school dance and she's just by the recycling bin and she keeps yelling at people who are throwing things in the trash, right? There's places that you can do it. So how can you go home today and find a way to incorporate climate change in some way in your story? Is it mentioning? Is it modeling? Is it, you know, having a whole story? We had a story with Elena and Lydia, the wonderful Rita Moreno, who do a green off, like has less of a footprint today, and it became a humorous story. I think Good Place did it so beautifully, talking about how, you know, the whole thing got messed up because we eat anything and the impact of it is horrible. So, you know, what are ways that you can challenge yourself to do that? I think all of us love a challenge sometimes, and going home and thinking, oh, how can I try to sneak this into my show in a way that is organic to the show, in a way where I can still make great stories, and I'm also being part of the solution.
Could I add one thing to that?
Please, yeah.
Also, just it's not a new kind of story, right? It's just writing about what it feels like to be alive right now, and this is a part of our lives.
If climate's not part of your story, then it's not a current story. And I'd like to add one last thing too, and that's there's so many creators here, but I know we also have execs. And one of the things that we were talking about backstage is the idea that this is going to be a long-term thing. And for so many creators, we come and we go, and our stories are in different places, and execs are actually the ones hopefully providing some of the continuity and the guidance. And so we need your help to do that as well. So that's important. We need you. We are almost at the end of our time. I could talk to these women all day long, but it's been an incredible summit. And I want to leave everybody with a little bit of hope. So I'm curious if you could offer some final words on what it is that's giving you hope right now. Say it! Say it!
Well, I do have a new fondness for the number 34. So, you know, actually, that's a really important question for all of us, because there is at least I feel, a sense of unsettledness and some worry about the direction of nearly everything, but certainly the country and the world. And, you know, that's understandable, especially coming out of the pandemic and everything that's going on in the world today. So how do you deal with that? And where I find hope is through action and through events like this, where, as you said, people wouldn't be here if you didn't care about the issue, if you didn't have some, you know, sense that there was something you could do that might make a difference to people. That's really hopeful, because at the end of the day, the only way we're going to be able to move forward with purpose and make progress on a lot of things, including, of course, climate change, if people, you know, take some sense of responsibility and feel empowered to act. And this new information about what's happening to kids, you know, there's a great opportunity to tell people who don't know that and to enlist more people to put a lot of creative energy to work in trying to understand how do we get this message across in a way that people will accept, that they will incorporate into their lives and their understanding. So I see a lot of hope in the way that people are not beaten down, they're resilient, they're determined, and that, you know, no matter how hard it is out there, we're not going to give in or give up. And we have to feel that, I think.
And I'll just do a plug for her playbook and for Anna Jane's playbook. How great is it that if the desire to tell these stories is there, but you don't feel like you necessarily have the resources to do so? They're two amazing resources that their orgs have put together. So Anna Jane, what's hopeful for you right now?
This might get me in trouble, but
Say it.
I don't love this question because where I live is already suffering. Even if we stop all fossil fuel emissions tomorrow, it's, you know, probably not going to survive in any way, shape, or form that I know it. There are already people who have lost their lives and their homes because of climate change. So for me, you know, sometimes hope is elusive. Sometimes I have it. Sometimes I don't. But what I can always grab onto is courage. And one of our advisors, an amazing NASA climate scientist named Dr. Kate Marvel, has this great quote that we don't need hope to fight in climate change, we need courage. And of course, the root to the word courage is heart and love. And so I think those are what really drive me. And it's also true for our stories, right? Frodo didn't go up against Sauron because he thought he was going to win. You know, the Rebel Alliance didn't go up against the Empire because they thought they were going to win. They did it because the stakes were too hard not to try. And like at the end of the day, no matter what happens, I know I want to leave this earth knowing that I did everything I could to try.
All right, Gloria, bring us home. Bring us home.
Oh my goodness. Well, I would say, you know, I was just at Latino International Film Festival, and I saw the work of the next generation. And it is very ever present for them. Climate change was living in these stories. So for me, seeing the next generation already without me having to say anything, doing this work because they are seeing it in real time impact their lives. So I feel very, very excited about the next generation of storyteller. And I think that I'm going to leave it with that.
All right. Thank you so much to our incredible panelists. And thanks to all of you and to the Environmental Media Association. Thanks, everyone.